Mary never let her forget how tough things were. To go to school no be the koko, na to find job, Mary always said, reminding Susanna that just because she had a degree didn't mean she would automatically get a job. In a busy city in Nigeria, two sisters lived with their mother in a big house. The younger sister, Susanna, had just finished her National Youth Service Corps (NYSC) program. She had studied hard in school, hoping to get a good job after graduating from the university. Now, she spent her days searching for a job, but nothing seemed to come her way. Her older sister, Mary, was different. Mary was a beautician who loved making people look beautiful. Every day, Mary would pack her big makeup box and go to work, trying her best to make others happy with her skills. One morning, Susanna was sitting on the sofa in their living room, watching Mary struggle down the stairs with her makeup box. Mary's face was scrunched up in frustration as she tried to balance the heavy box. Susanna couldn't help but smile a little. Her sister always looked funny when she was annoyed. That day was just another working day for Mary, but for Susanna, it felt like another boring day. She had always sent her CV to many companies, but she hadn't heard back from any of them. She was starting to feel like maybe she wasn't good enough to get a job, even though she knew she was smart and capable. Mary never let her forget how tough things were. To go to school no be the koko, na to find job, Mary always said, reminding Susanna that just because she had a degree didn't mean she would automatically get a job. Their mother was always busy with chores around the house. She had been both a mother and a father to Susanna and Mary since their father left Nigeria 10 years ago. He had gone abroad to look for a better job, but he never contacted them again. Their mother worked very hard to take care of the family, making sure her daughters grew up with love and discipline. When Mary finally reached the bottom of the stairs, she turned her frustration on Susanna. "Now your bad heart make you dey unfortunate," Mary snapped. "No pigeon, no abuse words in this house," their mother said as she walked into the room. Her voice was firm but kind. Susanna was glad their mother had intervened because she was ready to shout back at Mary. The tension between the sisters had been building up lately, especially since Susanna had been staying home more. Mary tried to explain herself. "Speaking pidgin is just for the cruise, mom. And tell your daughter to come join me in this makeup business, cause there is no job out there for people like her." Their mother was about to say something more to Mary, but Mary didn't wait to listen. She was already out of the door, her makeup box bumping behind her as she hurried away. The door banged loudly as she left, leaving a heavy silence in the house. Susanna knew Mary wasn't trying to be mean on purpose. She was just being realistic. But that didn't make the words hurt any less. Susanna felt a pang of pain in her chest. It hurt to think about how hard she had worked all through primary school, secondary school, and the university. She had done everything right, even served as a corps member, only to end up at home with no job and nowhere to go. It seemed so unfair that Mary, who didn't go to the university, had found something she loved and was good at, while Susanna was still searching for her path. Susanna sighed deeply. She felt so stuck, like she was in a place she didn't belong. She knew she had to stay positive and keep trying, but every day felt the same, and every rejection letter made her feel more and more like giving up. She tried to distract herself with chores, but even that didn't help much. The house was always clean, and there was no much to do. Her mother came over and sat beside her. She wrapped an arm around Susanna's shoulder and gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let your sister's words get to you, Susanna. She's just worried about you. We all are. But I know something good will come your way soon. Just keep believing in yourself." Susanna nodded. She knew her mother was right. Her mother always knew what to say to make her feel better, even if it was just for a little while. She hugged her mother back, thankful to have someone who cared so much for her. As the day went on, Susanna tried to stay busy. She cleaned the kitchen, washed the dishes, and swept the floors. She even tried to read a book, but her mind kept wandering. She couldn't stop thinking about what Mary had said. Maybe she should consider doing something different. Maybe it was time to think about another path like Mary had. The days slowly dragged by. Susanna wished she could fast forward to a time when things would get better, when she would have a job and be able to help her mother more. She didn't want to be a burden. She wanted to make her mother proud, to show her that all her sacrifices hadn't been for nothing. When the evening came, Mary returned home looking tired but satisfied. She had worked hard all day and managed to earn some money. She always seemed happier after a long day at work. Even if she complained about it in the morning, Susanna watched her sister as she put down her makeup box and stretched her arms. Mary glanced at Susanna and rolled her eyes. I hope you are not still sulking about what I said earlier. It's just the truth, sis. You need to find something to do. Sitting around won't help anything. Susanna knew Mary was right again, but she didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, she gave a small smile and nodded. I know, Mary. I'll figure out something. Mary gave a short nod and headed to her room. Susanna knew her sister cared, even if she had a funny way of showing it. She just wished things were different. She wished she could be as confident and happy as Mary. As the night grew darker, Susanna sat by the window looking out at the busy city. The lights twinkled like stars, and cars honked in the distance. She thought about her father and wondered what he was doing. If he ever thought about them, she missed him, but she knew she had to be strong, just like her mother. With a heavy heart, Susanna decided to go to bed. She knew tomorrow was another day, another chance to try again. She hoped that soon things would change for the better. She hoped that she would find her own path, just like Mary had found hers. And with that thought, Susanna closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of a brighter future where everything would finally fall in place. In the same bustling city where Susanna and Mary lived, there was a young man named Sylvester. Sylvester had recently returned from studying abroad. His father had been running a big company called Firm Choice Industry, but he was getting older and it was time for Sylvester to take over as the new CEO. He was the only son, the only one who could continue the family business. Sylvester had studied very hard while he was overseas. He learned all about accounting and business management, and now he was ready to put everything he had learned into practice. But being a CEO was not easy. He had a lot of responsibilities. There were many meetings to attend, a lot of important documents to read, and many phone calls to make. It was already midday, and Sylvester still had a long list of tasks to complete. As Sylvester sat on his desk, he went through some official letters. He was focused on signing important papers when his phone started ringing again. He glanced at the screen and saw it was Amaka calling. Amaka was a girl from Nigeria that his mother wanted him to marry, but Sylvester was not interested in her at all. He felt nothing for Amaka, but she kept trying to get closer to him, hoping he would change his mind. Sylvester sighed loudly and rolled his eyes as he looked at the phone. He didn't want to talk to Amaka, especially not today when he was already stressed. He pressed the button to end the call before it could even start. He felt annoyed and grumbled under his breath. Amaka this, Amaka that. I'm going through a lot and you are adding to my problems. Rubbish. Sylvester knew he needed to help managing all his tasks. Before he left the office that day, he spoke with his manager about hiring a personal assistant. He needed someone capable to help him organize his schedule, handle some of the calls, and make his work a bit easier. It was clear that running a company was not something one person could do alone, no matter how much they had learned. After a long day at work, Sylvester was tired and just wanted to go home and rest. But when he got home, He was not alone. His parents were there as usual, and so was his younger sister, who always greeted him with a warm smile. But then he noticed Amaka sitting there too. She was dressed up, looking very fancy, probably trying to impress him. Sylvester sighed again. He had not expected to see her. He gave his mother and sister a quick kiss on the cheek and said a polite good evening to his father. But he didn't hide his irritation when he looked at Amaka. He couldn't understand why she kept coming around when he had made it clear that he wasn't interested. How was work today, Mr. CEO? His mother asked playfully as his sister took his jacket to hang it up. Not fine. Work is hectic. I need a personal assistant, Sylvester replied quickly. He was too tired to talk much and just wanted to go to his room to rest. As he started to walk away, he noticed Amaka getting up to follow him. He stopped halfway and turned around to face her. What? He asked, clearly annoyed. Babe, Amaka began to say, but Sylvester cut her off. My name is Sylvester, okay? He said quietly but firmly, trying to keep his face down so his mother wouldn't hear and get upset. Look, I've given you signs. I told you in words. You are only but my mother's choice. Besides, marriage is not by force. Give me some space, he continued, his voice still in a low whisper. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked straight to his room, leaving Amaka standing there, looking a bit confused and hurt. He didn't want to be rude, but he was tired of repeating himself. He knew he had to be clear if he wanted her to understand. Inside his room, Sylvester took a deep breath and sat on his bed. He felt overwhelmed by everything. Taking over the company was a big responsibility, and he wanted to do his best, but it was hard to concentrate when he had so many distractions. He needed to stay focused and make sure he didn't let his family down. He knew that his father was counting on him, and he didn't want to disappoint him. As Sylvester lay back on his bed, he thought about his day. He knew that finding a good personal assistant would help a lot. Someone who could help manage his time and tasks would make things much easier. He decided that tomorrow he would start looking for the right person for the job. It was time to make some changes and get everything under control. Sylvester stayed in his room for much longer than he had planned, hoping that by the time he came out, Amaka would have left. He wanted to avoid any awkward encounter. He took a quick bath and dressed up in his comfortable nightwear, not wanting to be idle. He lay back on his bed and kept himself busy with his phone. He played some music, scrolled through some pictures, and even took his time to count the number of shoes in his wardrobe. He did anything he could think of to pass the time, just waiting for moments Amaka would be gone. After what felt like forever, the maid came around and knocked on his door to announce that dinner was ready. Sylvester immediately jumped out of bed, hoping this was the moment he had been waiting for. He quickly opened the door just a little bit and stared at the maid for a few seconds before asking, "Who is at the table?" The maid replied, "Your mother, father, and Sissy." Sylvester's eyes widened in surprise, and he almost shouted, "What? Amaka is still here?" The maid quickly shook her head and explained, "No, sir, Sissy is your sister." She then bowed and left quietly. Sylvester let out a big sigh of relief. He was glad that Amaka had finally left. Feeling much better, Sylvester walked down to the dining room. As he sat down, his father smiled and asked, "So tell me about work, son." Sylvester shrugged his shoulders and replied, Nothing special. Everything is good. I'm in control," he said, speaking with his mouth full of pasta. He didn't want to go into details because he was still thinking about how stressful the day had been. But before he could finish his sentence, his mother interrupted him. "You mentioned stress. How about Amaka joins you at work as his personal assistant?" Sylvester was caught off guard and nearly choked on his food. He quickly reached for his glass of water and took a big gulp. He then pushed his plate away slightly, showing he had lost appetite. His younger sister noticed his discomfort and tried to change the topic, but their mother wasn't finished. "Amaka thinks the best for you, Sylvester. His mother continued, "She's a chartered accountant. Both of you will make a perfect match, in and out of business." Sylvester's father sat quietly, not saying a word. He didn't show any sign of support or disagreement. He just watched and listened. Sylvester took a deep breath and said calmly, "Well, things aren't done that way. She would have to go through interviews and be approved by the company's board of trustees." His mother seemed ready to say more about Amaka, but Sylvester couldn't take it any longer. He stood up without saying another word and left the dining room. He walked back to his room feeling frustrated. He threw himself on his bed and picked up his phone. He decided to call his best friend and manager, Fred, hoping to get some advice. After a few rings, Fred answered the call with a cheerful voice. "Good evening, boss." Sylvester rolled his eyes and replied, "Hey man, my first name is Sylvester." Fred laughed a little and said, "You are my boss, so it's past working hours. Can we just be the best friends we are?" Sylvester insisted. "Okay, hey man, what's up?" "I have this feeling that you are bothered," Fred responded, sounding more serious now. Sylvester didn't waste any time. "Can you imagine, Fred?" he began. "Mom wants me to have Amaka as my personal assistant at work." Fred couldn't help but laugh out loud over the phone. "That would be a total disaster," he said, chuckling. Sylvester sighed deeply and said, "See, anyone who shows up first thing tomorrow morning for the job, employ." Fred was surprised and asked, "Wow, why the rush?" Sylvester explained, "Amaka cannot work with me. She's so clingy, seeks attention. She'll be all over me, and it would be a total disaster as you've mentioned. I hate it that I can't bring myself to tell mom plainly that Amaka is not for me." Back at Susanna's house, Susanna lay in bed, enjoying the comfort of her blanket, when suddenly the door to her room flew open. Mary, her big sister, hurried in without knocking. Susanna rubbed her eyes and sat up, frowning at Mary. "Hey, this is not fair," Susanna said, feeling annoyed. "I deserve some privacy." But Mary didn't seem to care. Instead, she smiled awkwardly at Susanna. "You know I love you, right?" she said, trying to ease the situation. Susanna gave her a suspicious look. She wasn't sure what Mary was up to, but she knew something was coming. Without saying another word, Mary reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. She waved it in front of Susanna's face. "Look, a job opportunity for someone like you," Mary said, grinning. Susanna's mood changed in an instant. She jumped out of bed with excitement. She had been waiting for an opportunity like this for a long time. Finally, there was a chance for her to get a job. "The good news is that they pay well," Mary continued, "but the bad news is that you have to apply in person and you only have 1 hour to get there." "What?" Susanna exclaimed, her heart racing. She had no time to waste. Susanna dashed into the bathroom. Time was ticking and she knew she had to hurry. 15 minutes later, she was out of the bathroom, dressed and ready to go. Mary stood there, amazed by how fast Susanna had gotten ready. "You seem a little desperate," Mary teased, raising an eyebrow. "It's not me who is desperate," Susanna replied, grabbing her handbag and a few other things she thought might be important. "It's the company that is desperate for someone." Susanna hurried down the stairs, her mind focused on getting to the company on time. In the living room, her mother sat comfortably on the sofa sipping tea. "So Mary had already told you about the job?" her mother asked as Susanna walked past. Susanna nodded quickly. She had no time to sit and chat. She was too focused on making it to the interview. Her mother frowned. "Are you sure this is a good idea? Rushing into decision can be risky," she said, her voice filled with concern. But Mary waved her hand dismissively. "Spare her the long talk, Mom," Mary said with a sigh. "She's in a hurry." Susanna barely heard them. She was already out the door, her heart beating fast with anticipation. She couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. At Firm Choice Company, Fred, the manager, sat in his office, going through some papers. The day had been busy, and there were few interviews lined up. His secretary knocked on the door and entered the room. "She's here for the job interview," the secretary said before leaving. Fred glanced at his watch. It was almost time for the interview. A few minutes later, Susanna was sitting in front of him answering questions as best as she could. She felt nervous but tried to stay calm. After the interview, Susanna was asked to wait in the reception area. Her mind was racing with thoughts. Had she done enough? Would they give her the job? She couldn't stop thinking about it. Meanwhile, Fred picked up the phone and called his boss Sylvester. The conversation was brief but important. "Hey boss," Fred said when Sylvester answered the call. "The interview is done. We found someone for the job." "All I want to hear is good news," Sylvester replied, his voice firm. Fred hesitated for a moment. "Well, she's very beautiful. She's tall too. Honestly, I could recommend her for modeling, not this accounting job." "Why not hire her?" Sylvester asked, sounding curious. Fred sighed. "She graduated with a second-class upper degree, but it's in food science, not accounting or any related field. Plus, she has no work experience." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Sylvester spoke again. "I want you to hire her." Fred couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What?" "I said hire her," Sylvester repeated. "You can train her, but make sure she gets the job." Fred was still shocked. It wasn't every day that Sylvester made such decisions. Normally, qualifications and experience mattered a lot, but this time it seemed different. "I don't understand, sir," Fred said, still confused. "Are you sure?" "Just do as I say, Fred," Sylvester replied, his voice firm. "I'll explain everything later. For now, she's the one I want for the job." Sylvester cut the call and sank back into the sofa. He felt relieved. Truthfully, it was a good feeling to have a new assistant at work. He imagined how awful it would have been to have Amaka by his side all the time. He decided he would explain to his mother that Amaka was simply late for the interview, so they had to hire someone else. At Fame Choice Company, Susanna was still sitting at the reception area. She had been waiting for a while, wondering what would happen next. She watched as people moved around the office, busy with their work. Suddenly, she noticed a man walking in with a commanding presence. It was Sylvester. His presence made everyone stand up and give him a slight bow as he walked past them. Susanna found it a bit strange. She was not used to such a display of respect. She remained in her seat, watching Sylvester closely as he walked past the receptionist and headed for the elevator. Unlike everyone else, Susanna did not stand up or bow. She just sat there observing him with curiosity. Sylvester, on his part, was aware of everything happening around him. As he walked, he noticed Susanna sitting still while everyone else stood. He stopped and turned to look at her. His eyes were intense, almost intimidating, but Susanna didn't seem to care. She looked back at him, meeting his gaze directly. They stared at each other for a few moments, eye to eye. Sylvester was surprised by her boldness. He was not used to people looking him in the eyes like that. Eventually, he had to look away, feeling a bit unsettled. "Who the hell is she?" Sylvester muttered under his breath as he stepped into the elevator. He couldn't understand why she wasn't like the others. After a few minutes, the elevator door opened and Sylvester stepped out on his floor. He walked quickly to his office, still thinking about the girl he had seen downstairs. Once inside his office, he picked up the phone and called his manager, Fred. "Yes, sir," Fred answered promptly. "Bring her in," Sylvester said, and then hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. There was a knock on his office door shortly after. A little pause, then another knock. Fred stepped in with Susanna walking closely behind him. "Here she is, sir," Fred said politely. Sylvester was still sitting at his desk, jotting something down on a notepad. He did not look up or acknowledge them right away. "I'll leave you two," Fred said again before leaving the room. The door closed quietly behind him. Sylvester continued writing, not even bothering to look up at Susanna or offer her a seat. There was an uncomfortable silence in the room. Susanna waited for a few moments, but when Sylvester didn't say anything, she decided to speak up. "Excuse me, sir," Susanna said, trying to get his attention. Sylvester replied without looking up. "As you can see, I'm a little busy." Susanna felt a bit annoyed by his rudeness. She muttered under her breath, "How rude." Sylvester looked up quickly. his eyes narrowing. What did you say? He asked sharply. Susanna kept her calm. Nothing, sir, she replied. I could swear I heard you speak. Sylvester insisted, not letting it go. I said nothing for you to comprehend, sir. Susanna blurted out before she could stop herself. Sylvester raised an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. In other words, it was none of my business, he said, trying to understand her. Your opinion, Susanna replied coolly. Sylvester was taken aback. He wasn't used to people talking back to him like this. He finally looked up properly and saw her face. It was the same young woman he had noticed downstairs, the one who had stared at him without fear. He was surprised to see that she had the same confidence on her face. For a moment, they stared at each other again, but this time, Susanna looked away first. Sylvester couldn't help but feel intrigued by this unusual girl who seemed so different from everyone else he had met. Amaka was sitting on the sofa in her living room with her friend Grace. They were having a good time chatting and laughing. On the table in front of them was a pack of juice and two glasses, each half filled. Grace was excitedly talking about a new dress she wanted. This dress is the latest trend, girl, Grace said, pointing at a picture in a fashion magazine she was holding. I'm definitely going to get it. Amaka laughed and nodded. I know, right? She said. She enjoyed their chat about fashion and trends. It always cheered her up. You should get it too, Grace suggested. You know what? Let's go shopping this weekend. Amaka shook her head slowly. I'm not sure, Grace. I'll be at Sylvester's place throughout this weekend, she replied. As soon as Amaka mentioned Sylvester, Grace's smile faded. She quietly took a sip from her glass of juice, thinking about what to say next. She knew how much Amaka cared about Sylvester, but she also knew something that Amaka didn't. Amaka noticed Grace's change in mood. What? She asked, looking concerned. Why did you go quiet all of a sudden? Grace finally spoke up after a long pause. You don't really mean to spend the whole weekend at Sylvester's place, do you? She asked. Amaka looked a bit defensive. His mother invited me, she explained, trying to justify her plans. Grace raised an eyebrow. Oh well, he didn't, she pointed out. Amaka sighed. You and I know that I love Sylvester, and Grace cut her off before she could finish. Well, he doesn't love you, she said bluntly. Amaka's face fell. She didn't like hearing that. Don't say that to me, she frowned. He will get to love me too. Besides, I have his mother's support. Grace looked at Amaka with a mixture of concern and disbelief. She let out a long, sharp hiss. If you say so, she muttered under her breath. Amaka wanted to change the subject. Talking about Sylvester was making her uncomfortable. Let's talk about something else, please, she suggested. How is work? Grace paused for a moment before speaking. Is it because of his money that you are refusing to let go? She asked suddenly. Amaka felt a bit insulted by the question. Please, can we talk about something else? She said firmly, not wanting to discuss it anymore. Grace sighed. Just so you know, she began, we have a new employee at work, and she's going to be Sylvester's personal assistant. They'll be sharing the same office. Amaka looked surprised. How did you get such information? She asked, curious about how Grace knew this. Grace chuckled. Stop sounding like you don't know me, she teased. Hello, I'm Miss Grace, his manager's secretary. Amaka sat up slowly, her interest piqued by what Grace was saying. She wanted to know more about this new person. Grace continued, sensing Amaka's curiosity. She's not just any woman. Oh, she's with a knowing look. She's beautiful, confident. In fact, she's charming. And like I said, they'll be sharing the same office. Amaka didn't like what she was hearing. She felt a knot forming in her stomach. Stop it, she almost yelled. Sylvester's life is not some movie. He won't fall for her. Grace looked at her friend with concern. I hope so. I really do, she said softly. Meanwhile, back at the company, Sylvester was still thinking about Susanna. He was surprised by her confidence and boldness. She was not like anyone he had met before, and it left him feeling intrigued. He wondered how she would fit in as his assistant. Susanna, on the other hand, was thinking about her new job. She was excited but also a bit nervous about working with someone like Sylvester. She could tell he was used to getting his way and was not sure how she would manage in the same office with him. The atmosphere in the company was tense, and everyone was curious about Susanna. They whispered among themselves, wondering who she was and why Sylvester seemed interested in her. They had never seen their boss pay so much attention to anyone before. Susanna tried her best to ignore the whispers and focus on her tasks. She knew she had to prove herself in this new job, and she was determined to do her best. She sat at her desk, organizing some files and preparing for her first day as Sylvester's assistant. As the day went on, Sylvester couldn't help but glance at Susanna from time to time. He found himself wondering what it was about her that made her so different. He was curious to learn more about her, but he didn't want to show it. He wanted to keep his distance, at least for now. Back at Amaka's house, she couldn't stop thinking about what Grace had said. The thought of another woman working closely with Sylvester bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She had always hoped that one day Sylvester would see her differently, that he would realize she was the one for him. But now, with this new woman around, she felt her chances slipping away. Grace could see the worry on Amaka's face. She wanted to comfort her friend, but she also knew that Amaka needed to face the truth. Maybe it's time you move on, Amaka, Grace suggested gently. You deserve someone who truly cares for you. Amaka shook her head, refusing to give up. I can't just walk away, Grace. Not now, not ever, she said firmly. I will fight for Sylvester no matter what. Grace sighed. She knew how stubborn Amaka could be. Just be careful, she warned. You might end up getting hurt. Amaka nodded, but deep down, she was more determined than ever. She would not let some new assistant come between her and Sylvester. She would find a way to make him see that she was the one who truly loved him. Working with Sylvester turned out to be very difficult for Susanna. Every day seemed like a new challenge. Sylvester never showed any appreciation for all the hard work she put in. He always found faults and never hesitated to point them out. Even when Susanna did something right, he would never acknowledge it. Instead, he focused on her mistakes. No matter how small they were, it was clear to everyone around that Sylvester didn't like Susanna very much. If there had been another person ready to take her place, he would have gladly replaced her without a second thought. Susanna often felt frustrated and unappreciated. Her job was not easy, and Sylvester's constant criticism made it even harder. However, she was determined to prove herself. She didn't want to give up, so she continued working diligently, doing her best to fulfill all her responsibilities. Thankfully, Susanna had a friend in the office, Fred. Fred was kind and supportive, and he helped her settle into her new role. He was always there to guide her and offer advice when she needed it. He introduced her to other staff members and made sure she felt included. Fred also helped Susanna understand the company's cultures and get along with other colleagues. But before long, Susanna and Fred developed a good friendship. They were often seen together during lunch breaks, talking and laughing. They enjoyed sharing their thoughts and opinions about work and life. Susanna was a dedicated worker. She handled all the emails and letters meant for Sylvester and was always present when important clients visited the office. She made sure to keep track of the activities of other staff members and submitted her complete work to Sylvester's desk every morning. Despite all her efforts, Sylvester still refused to acknowledge Susanna's capabilities. He seemed to have a problem with her confidence, unlike other male staff who were nervous around him, or female staff who went out of their way to please him. Susanna was different. She was not afraid to look him in the eye when speaking to him, and she always maintained her poise. One Friday afternoon, Sylvester was in the office lounge, visibly upset. Susanna is so unbearable, he complained to Fred. Fred, who was enjoying his coffee, looked at Sylvester and said, I think she's a perfect 10. Sylvester frowned. She's a log of wood, he replied. Fred raised an eyebrow. You mean strong and sturdy? He asked with a teasing smile. No, Sylvester snapped back. I mean unresponsive and uninteresting. Fred, curious about Sylvester's frustration, asked, exactly what do you want from her? Sylvester didn't have an answer. He just sipped his coffee, clearly annoyed. Fred then surprised Sylvester with a suggestion. You know, man, I think I should make some advances at her, he said with a grin. Sylvester almost choked on his coffee. He gave Fred a skeptical look and let out a sharp hiss. What? He exclaimed. Fred defended his idea. You of all people know it's unprofessional and wrong to make advances at my personal assistant, Sylvester said firmly. Besides, like I said, she is only but a log of wood. Fred chuckled. That's just your opinion, he said. Besides, I will set my boundaries and avoid anything that disrupts work. But Sylvester wasn't having any of it. No, man, and I mean it. It's a no, he said firmly. Fred laughed at Sylvester's reaction. You are unbelievable, he chuckled. As usual, Grace, Freddie's secretary and Amaka's friend, kept Amaka updated on everything happening at work. Grace made sure to tell Amaka about how everyone at the office thought Susanna was doing an excellent job. This news did not sit well with Amaka. She felt threatened by Susanna's presence at the office and could not stand the idea of Sylvester spending so much time with her. Determined to keep her place in Sylvester's life, Amaka started visiting his office more frequently. At first, she would show up once a week, but soon her visits became more regular. Every time she visited, she made sure to look her best, wearing her most stylish clothes and flaunting her beauty. It was clear she wanted to make an impression, especially in front of Susanna. Whenever Amaka visited, she would ask to see Sylvester. They would have the same boring conversation every time. How is work? Amaka would ask, trying to make small talk. Sylvester would just nod, not saying anything. How is your health? Amaka would continue. Sylvester would nod again, still not saying anything. That Susanna girl, Amaka would start, trying to bring up the topic she was most interested in. But Sylvester would simply nod once more, not engaging in the conversation. Bay, Amaka would try to get his attention, but Sylvester would cut her off. Please leave, he would say, ending the conversation. Amaka's constant visit became a nuisance to Sylvester. He grew tired of her showing up unannounced and interrupting his work. It got to the point where Sylvester couldn't stand her anymore. Whenever Amaka appeared at the office, he would sneak out and not return for the rest of the day. This became a pattern, and everyone in the office noticed Sylvester's strange behavior. Susanna, on the other hand, found her work becoming more demanding. With Sylvester avoiding the office more often, she had to handle many of his responsibilities. The burden of extra work weighed heavily on her, but she continued to do her best, determined not to let Sylvester down. She was tired of the unfair treatment and wanted to prove that she was capable of handling her job. Then one Monday morning, something unexpected happened. Susanna did something that no one could have imagined. It was a bold move that would change everything. That morning, Amaka decided to visit the office again. This time, she wore a bright red dress that was so revealing. She paired the dress with high heels, and her makeup was much more dramatic than usual. As soon as she walked in, the office buzzed with whispers and gossip. Everyone noticed her bold appearance and couldn't help but watch. A small group quickly formed near the entrance, their eyes fixed on Amaka. As expected, she went straight to the receptionist, demanding to see Sylvester. Susanna had just finished some work and was about to leave the office for an errand. She stopped in her tracks when she saw Amaka. At first, Susanna thought about ignoring her, but the look on Amaka's face filled her with disgust. Susanna decided not to let Amaka cause more trouble, so she stepped back and blocked Amaka from entering Sylvester's office. Amaka glared at Susanna with a hateful expression. What the hell? Get out of my way, she shouted, her voice filled with anger. Susanna remained calm. Your presence is not appreciated here. You should leave, she replied firmly. Amaka's face twisted in rage. I've heard about your intentions towards my fiancé, she snapped. She looked ready to fight, and her voice was loud and aggressive. Out of my way, mistress. Susanna was taken aback. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. In her mind, she and Sylvester had never gotten along well, and now someone thought she was interested in him. Susanna realized that Amaka must have felt insecure because of her job with Sylvester. She took a deep breath and just said, I owe you no explanation, miss. Just leave before I call security. Amaka's face turned with anger. Sylvester is my fiancé, she screamed at the top of her lungs. By now, a crowd of staff members had gathered around them. Some were filming the scene on their phones, while others tried to calm Amaka down and convince her to leave. It was clear that this situation was getting out of control. Susanna's patience was wearing thin. She spoke sharply to Amaka, saying, I don't care. You are nothing but a distraction. You are also so shameless. Just look at how you are dressed. Amaka's face turned even redder, and she felt embarrassed by Susanna's words. She raised her hand to hit Susanna, but before she could, Fred stepped in with two security men. They quickly intervened, pulling Amaka away from Susanna and calming the crowd down. The security men then escorted Amaka out of the office, forcing her to leave. Susanna stood there, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was racing, and she felt overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. She couldn't believe the scene that had unfolded in front of everyone. Just then, a thought crossed her mind. Where was Sylvester during all this? He had been in his office the whole time, but didn't do anything to help or stop the situation. Curious and a bit frustrated, Susanna walked over to Sylvester's office door. She opened it slightly and peeked inside. To her surprise, Sylvester was just sitting there, calm and unbothered. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Susanna quickly closed the door, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. She turned around and walked away, her mind racing with thoughts. Susanna arrived at home that evening, feeling exhausted. Her sister Mary, excited and unaware of her sister's mood, immediately ran up to her. Susanna, she exclaimed, her face lighting up with a big smile. But Susanna, clearly drained, made her way straight to her room without even responding to Mary. Not wanting to give up, Mary followed her. Goodness, sis, you've gone viral, Mary giggled, her excitement bubbling over as she walked into Susanna's room without even bothering to knock. Susanna was already in bed, hiding under the blanket, clearly wanting to be left alone. She hissed, I've really had a stressful day at work. Don't add to my problems, Mary. Look nah, Mary insisted, thrusting her phone towards Susanna. The screen showed a video reel on the scene from earlier that day at the office. That's you, sis, she said with a mixture of excitement and concern. Susanna gasped in disbelief. She couldn't believe her eyes. The staff from the office had actually posted the video online. It had quickly gone viral with captions like, In love with the boss's assistant, fight for love at the office. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. Susanna hadn't expected her private confrontation with Amaka to be turned into such a public spectacle. What happened? Really? Mary asked, her tone shifting to a more serious one as she sat down beside Susanna on the bed. Susanna shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Leave me alone, Mary. I'm so stressed. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, trying to block out the world. Mary watched her sister for a moment, her brows furrowed in worry. Something is odd, she noted, her voice soft but firm. You've been in bed since you got back from work. Well, I'm tired, Susanna replied, her voice muffled by the blanket. I've seen you tired other times. This is different, Mary pressed, not ready to let it go. Can you leave now? Susanna said, her tone sharper than before, her patience wearing thin. Mary sighed, sensing that it was best not to push further. If you need anything, just let me know, she said gently before leaving the room, closing the door softly behind her. The next morning, Susanna didn't feel any better. In fact, she felt worse. She woke up with a severe headache and her body was shivering all over. She tried to get out of bed, but her body refused to cooperate. Her mother and Mary quickly noticed something was wrong and rushed to her side. Seeing her condition, they decided to take her to the hospital immediately. Meanwhile, across town, Sylvester was having a rough morning of his own. As he prepared to leave for work, his mother had confronted him about Amaka's recent behavior. She was upset, believing Sylvester should have done more to handle the situation. Sylvester, already irritated, became even more frustrated. He stormed out of the house, his mind swelling with anger and confusion. As he drove to work, Sylvester couldn't stop thinking about Susanna and the mess that had happened at the office. He was determined to confront her. She claimed to be my fiancé, but you still showed no regard. He muttered under his breath, practicing what he planned to say. Practically, you disrespected me, he continued, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When he arrived at the office, Sylvester headed straight for his desk. He expected to see everything in its usual place, perfectly organized by Susanna, but to his surprise, the files on his desk were in complete disarray. Papers were scattered everywhere, and there was no sign of Susanna. Confused and even more irritated, he sat down heavily in his chair, wondering where she could be. Just then, a staff member walked in, holding a small envelope. Someone brought this morning, the staff member said, placing the envelope on Sylvester's desk. It's from Miss Susanna, they added before quickly leaving the room. Sylvester stared at the envelope for a moment, a sense of dread creeping over him. Slowly, he picked it up and tore it open. As he began to read the letter, his face turned pale. The words on the page felt like a heavy blow to his chest. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The message in the letter hit him hard, leaving him feeling weak and disoriented. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to Susanna and the letter. For the rest of the day, he found it nearly impossible to concentrate, his thoughts swelling in a chaotic mix of confusion and frustration. Fred sat at the desk, feeling uneasy. Sylvester hadn't left his office all day, and that wasn't like him. Usually, Sylvester would be moving around, giving orders or at least making his presence known. But today, his office door swayed closed. Fred couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. He had seen Sylvester like this before, but it was rare and usually meant something serious was on his mind. Fred decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He got up, walked over to Sylvester's office and knocked on the door. He didn't wait for a response before pushing the door open. When he entered, he saw Sylvester sitting at his desk, his head bent down, staring at a piece of paper. He didn't even look up when Fred entered. Fred walked closer, noticing the tense way Sylvester was sitting, like he was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. Sylvester, he called softly, what is going on? Why are you just sitting here like this? Sylvester looked up, but his eyes were distant, as if he was lost in thought. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words came out in a rush, almost like he couldn't get them out of his mind first. I'm not. I can't explain. I just... Oh, Fred. His voice strayed off, and Fred could barely understand what he was saying. Fred held up a hand to stop him. Don't say anything more, he said gently. Take a breath and start again. Slowly this time. Sylvester took a deep breath and began again, more calmly than this time. Sylvester took a deep breath and began again, more calmly this time. I got a message from Susanna yesterday. He said, it's a threat to resign. Fred's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected that. Sylvester, usually so composed and in control, was genuinely worried about this. It didn't seem possible. You mean this is the reason you are so upset? Fred asked, trying to keep the disbelief out of his voice. Sylvester nodded. Well, of course, I mean, she's hardworking, and his voice trailed off again. and he couldn't seem to find the right words to continue. Fred stared at him for a moment before bursting into laughter. Really? That's what got you so bothered? She's a good worker, sure, but we can always find another personal assistant, Fred said, eyeing Sylvester carefully. Sylvester's reaction was immediate. He gasped, almost like Fred had slapped him. No, he said quickly. Things aren't done that way. Where would you find someone like her? Fred raised an eyebrow. So, do you want a personal assistant or do you want Susanna? Sylvester's face turned red and he tried to look annoyed. What kind of question is that? Fred just smiled. I promise I'll find someone capable for you, someone more respectful. No one should make you feel threatened like this. So, Fred let this sentence trail off, watching Sylvester's reaction. No, Sylvester said again, more firmly this time. Susanna shouldn't resign. She's just different, okay? I can't imagine her leaving. Fred, you are my best friend. You should understand. Fred watched his friend closely. Sylvester looked miserable, like he was struggling to express something he didn't fully understand himself. It was clear that there was more to his feeling about Susanna than he was admitting, maybe even to himself. Fred stood up. A small smile played at his lips. All right, Sylvester, he said. I will leave you to figure all this out. He turned and left the office, leaving Sylvester to his thoughts. As he walked down the stairs, Fred muttered to himself, Sylvester and Susanna, such a combo. Fred couldn't help but chuckle softly to himself. He knew his friend better than anyone, and he could see that Sylvester couldn't or wouldn't admit. There was something there, something Sylvester wasn't ready to acknowledge. Back in his office, Sylvester sat in silence, staring at the letter from Susanna. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion. He didn't understand why he was so bothered by the thought of her leaving, by the idea of not having her around, of not seeing her every day, filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake off. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, trying to sort through his feelings. He thought about all the times he had been harsh with her, all the times he had brushed off her suggestion or acted like she was just another employee. But she wasn't just another employee. She was Susanna, and for some reason, that seemed to mean a lot more than he was willing to admit. Susanna was restless. She had been sick for days, and she couldn't find any comfort in her bed. She kept turning from one side to the other, trying to find a position that would help her feel better. The blankets felt heavy, and the room seemed too quiet. Her thoughts were spinning in circles, making her feel dizzy and uncomfortable. Being homesick is so miserable, she muttered to herself. She wanted to feel better, to get up and do something, but her body felt weak, and she was tired of feeling like this. There was a soft knock on the door, and then her mom stepped into the room, carrying a small pink tray with a glass of water and some medicine on it. Susanna's eyes widened when she saw the medicine. The thought of taking more pills made her feel even worse. Mom, Susanna said with a frown, hoping to avoid the medicine. It's 3 minutes past your evening dose. Her mom replied gently, setting the tray down on the beside table. You need to take those medicines now. Please get up. I can't, Susanna cried, scrunching up her face as she caught the strong smell of the medicine. I'm going to throw up if I take those. Her mom gave her a stern look. Don't be so childish, Susanna. You know you need to take your medication to get better. Susanna sighed dramatically. Okay, count down to 10, she said, trying to delay the inevitable. Must we always do this? Her mom grumbled, but started the countdown anyway. 10, 9, 8, 7. Mary burst into the room without knocking. Don't you ever learn to knock? Susanna snapped, annoyed by the sudden interruption. Mary just rolled her eyes. You have a visitor, she announced, completely ignoring Susanna's irritation. Susanna exchanged a puzzled look with her mom. A visitor? She wasn't expecting anyone. She had a few friends from school, but they all lived far away, and none of her co-workers knew where she lived. So who could be that? Susanna wondered aloud, feeling a mix of curiosity and confusion. Is it a male? Her mom asked, raising an eyebrow. Mary nodded with a big smile. Susanna rolled her eyes again. Well, I can't get out of bed, she said, trying to avoid the situation. Let him in, Mary. Her mom instructed, surprising Susanna. What? Susanna gasped in shock. Don't, she pleaded, but Mary had already left to bring the visitor upstairs. Susanna panicked. Mom, I can't have a male visitor in my room, she exclaimed. But then, as if by magic, she suddenly found the strength to get out of bed. She quickly walked to her wardrobe, pulling out something simple but nice to wear. She brushed her hair in a hurry and glanced at herself in the mirror to make sure she looked presentable. Out of the corner of her eyes, she saw her mom smiling at her. Mom, that's so embarrassing, Susanna groaned, feeling her cheeks turn red. Here we come, Sus, Mary called out from the hallway. For once, she didn't burst into the room without knocking. Susanna rushed to the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her quickly. She breathed, relieved that her room was now private. She turned to face Mary and the visitor, but when she saw who it was, she froze. Standing in the hallway, holding a fancy shopping bag, was Sylvester, her boss. Susanna couldn't believe her eyes. This was the last person she expected to see. Sylvester wasn't wearing his usual suit and tie. Instead, he was dressed in a casual clothes, something she had never seen him in before. He smelled fresh and his whole demeanor was different. He looked almost relaxed. Susanna realized she had been staring at him for far too long. She felt embarrassed and quickly tried to compose herself. Hi, she finally managed to say, her voice sounding more surprised than she intended. After Sylvester's surprising visit to Susanna's home, he spent some time with her, asking about her health and how she was feeling. Susanna, though still a bit weak, felt a bit better with his unexpected concern. They talked about work and everything that had happened in the office while she was away. Sylvester made sure to fill her in all the updates, mentioning some funny incidents and trying to keep the conversation light. He was careful not to mention anything that would stress her, knowing she needed rest. Susanna listened quietly, nodding at his stories and trying to smile even though she felt still tired. It was strange seeing Sylvester in a different light. He wasn't being the strict boss she used to know him as. Instead, he seemed genuinely worried about her. After some time, Sylvester stood up and said he had to leave. He wished Susanna a quick recovery, hoping she would get well soon and come back to the office. Susanna thanked him, appreciating his visit even if it was unexpected. Sylvester left, and Susanna was left wondering what to think of the whole situation. Meanwhile, in another part of the town, Amaka visited Sylvester's family, as she often did. She was sitting in the living room with Sylvester's mother, looking upset. Amaka had been trying to get Sylvester to notice her for years, but it seemed like all her efforts were in vain. Grace tells me everything. It's always Susanna with Sylvester, Amaka complained, her voice full of frustration. Those two are getting along so well, and I don't like it one bit. Shh. Sylvester's mom hushed Amaka, trying to calm her down. She didn't want the whole house to hear their conversation. Amaka was not one to be easily calmed. She was really upset about the situation. She had been patient, thinking that one day Sylvester would notice her and fall for her. But now, it seemed like he was paying more attention to Susanna, and that made her angry. Amaka continued, he barely had time for any woman, and that's the reason why I've been so patient with him. But recently, Grace told me he's been acting differently around that Susanna girl. Sylvester's mom frowned. She wasn't happy about this news either. She had known Amaka's mother for a long time, and she had always hoped that Amaka would become her daughter-in-law. She didn't like the idea of Sylvester getting close to someone. See, you have my full support, Sylvester's mom assured her. Just be patient and make him fall for you while I do my part. Amaka, however, was not satisfied with this answer. She had her own ideas. The only way this would work is by getting pregnant for him, Amaka said boldly. Then later on, he will learn to love me. Sylvester's mom was shocked by Amaka's suggestion. No, Amaka, no, she said firmly. I'll support you in everything, but this is extreme. Amaka rolled her eyes, dismissing Sylvester's mom's concern. Such things happen all the time. She argued, as if it were not a big deal. You will not do that to my son, Sylvester's mom said sternly, her voice rising. She could not believe how desperate Amaka was sounding. Not after you had me wait for him foolishly for 3 good years, Amaka snapped back. I could have done something more important with my life, you know. Sylvester's mom was taken aback by Amaka's harsh words. She realized that Amaka was much more desperate and determined than she had thought. Before she could say anything more, Amaka stood up abruptly and walked towards the door. Just as she was leaving, she bumped into Sylvester, who was just coming back from work. Sylvester barely acknowledged her. He walked past her and his mother without saying a word, heading straight to his room. Amaka felt insulted and stormed out of the house. Fuming with anger, Sylvester's mom watched her leave, feeling a mix of disappointment and concern. Sylvester entered his room, feeling tired and confused. He threw himself on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing with thoughts of about the day's work and his strange feelings towards Susanna. He didn't know why he couldn't stop thinking about her. After a few minutes, he picked up his phone and dialed Fred's number. Fred was his best friend, and he often went to him for advice. What's up, man? Suzanne is so difficult, Sylvester began, his voice full of frustration. She's always keeping things professional, never letting her guard down. She makes me feel like a fool sometimes, you know. Fred listened patiently. Were you being direct about your feelings for her? He asked calmly. Well, no, you don't expect me to be so obvious, Sylvester replied, feeling defensive. But I gave her hints, which I'm sure she understood. But all the talks about is business, saying things like I'm a distraction to her work. Fred chuckled softly. Well, she's right, you know. If you're not clear about your intentions, how do you expect her to know? Fred, Sylvester sighed, feeling a bit annoyed. He was looking for support, not criticism. Anyway, Fred said, sounding more serious now, I have a plan. Before Sylvester could ask what the plan was, Fred hung up the phone. Sylvester stared at his phone, confused but curious about what Fred was thinking. He hoped that whatever Fred had in his mind would help him figure out his feelings for Susanna and maybe even help him win her over. The next day, Sylvester woke up early, feeling a sense of determination he hadn't felt in a long time. He got ready for work, putting on his sharp black suit and matching trousers. His tie was perfectly knotted, and his shoes shone brightly. His hair was neatly combed, and the scent of his perfume filled the room with a welcoming fragrance. He looked at himself in the mirror and nodded. Today was going to be a good day. As he walked through the reception area of the office, all the staff stood up with their heads bowed in respect. Sylvester didn't smile, nor did he frown. He kept a neutral expression on his face as he made his way to his office. Susanna, who had recently returned to work after her time away, had everything organized before he arrived. Sylvester sat down comfortably in his chair and went straight to work. He remained focused throughout the day, barely smiling or showing any emotion. Although he praised Susanna for her good work, he didn't hesitate to point out her mistakes. Susanna found his behavior rather strange. He was acting so differently from how he used to. He was more serious, almost distant. Despite this, Susanna couldn't help but notice how well Sylvester carried himself. He was the perfect example of a well-dressed and confident man. She hadn't really looked at him that way before. He was always her boss, someone to respect and listen to. But now, there was something more to him, something she found herself drawn to. Once or twice, Susanna tried to start a friendly conversation, hoping to break the ice, but Sylvester dismissed her each time. He didn't laugh at her jokes or even chuckle. Susanna felt embarrassed, even a little silly. She wasn't used to feeling this way. She prided herself on being confident and capable, but now she felt clumsy, like she couldn't do anything right. When work ended for the day, Susanna would be the first to leave the office. She didn't want to hang around and feel uncomfortable. This continued for 2 weeks. Susanna tried her best to be professional and efficient personal assistant she had always been, but nothing seemed to work. Sylvester was acting differently, and she couldn't figure out why. It seemed like she missed the old Sylvester, the one who wasn't so serious at all time. But why did she feel this way? One evening, when work was done, Susanna had to stay back to finish some important tasks. By the time she was done, everyone else had gone home except Sylvester. He was sitting idly at the reception, looking like he was deep in thought. Susanna tried to walk past him quietly, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but he stood up to leave at the same time. Sylvester walked to his car, then turned back to look at her. "You've been really helpful today," he said suddenly. At first, Susanna wasn't sure he was talking to her. It wasn't until he offered to drive her home that she realized he was. "No thanks," Susanna replied politely, avoiding eye contact. She didn't want to seem too eager. "This might be your only chance, Sus," a small voice inside her head whispered. Susanna frowned, wondering why she was thinking like this. A chance to do what? She muttered to herself, trying to push away her confusing feelings for Sylvester. "What did you say?" Sylvester asked, looking at her curiously. "Nothing. Nothing important," Susanna replied quickly. She turned to leave, but Sylvester stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "It's not safe to go home by yourself," Sylvester said, her voice gentle. "It's late, and you've shown how dedicated you are to your work by staying back. The least I can do is to give you a ride." Susanna hesitated, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. It was indeed late, and she had worked hard. Plus, the voice in her head kept telling her that maybe this was her chance to get to know Sylvester better. She finally agreed, nodding her head slightly. During the car ride, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Once, Susanna caught Sylvester glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She felt her face grow hot, and her heart began to race. She wasn't sure what to think of his attention, but she couldn't help but feel little excited. When they arrived at their apartment, Susanna got out of the car first. She walked toward her flat with Sylvester following behind. When they reached her door, she stopped and turned to face him. "Thanks for bringing me home," she said with a small smile, though it quickly faded. For a few moments, they stood there in silence, neither one knowing what to say. Finally, Sylvester broke the silence. "You've been very reliable." Finally, Sylvester broke the silence. "You've been very reliable at work," he said softly. "I must confess, I've never met someone quite like you." Susanna didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, feeling her cheeks warm up again. "All my life, I've never had someone influence me the way you did," Sylvester continued. "You've made me see things differently, and I can't really explain it, but I feel different since I've known you." Susanna felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't know what to say. This was the last thing she expected to hear from her boss. "I've developed special feelings for you," Sylvester admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's been hard for me to say this, but it's the truth." Susanna felt goosebumps on her arms. She was glad it was dark, so Sylvester couldn't see her blushing. She didn't know what to say, so she nervously picked at her fingernails, trying to distract herself. "This is the hardest thing I've ever had to say to a woman," Sylvester said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I want you to know that it's not something I'm making up." "It's getting late," Susanna finally managed to say, her voice shaky. She needed to get inside before she did something foolish. She turned and hurried inside her apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. Sylvester watched her go, feeling a mix of disappointment and relief. At least, he had finally told her how he felt. He got back into his car and drove off, feeling strangely happy that he had gotten everything off his chest. After that night, something changed between Sylvester and Susanna. They started spending more time together after work. They didn't talk much, but just being in each other's company was enough. Susanna's mother was pleased with the young man her daughter had chosen to spend time with. She had always wanted Susanna to find someone who was kind and respectful, and Sylvester seemed to be just that. Mary, Susanna's sister, couldn't stop dreaming about their wedding day. She would often tease Susanna, saying that she could already see them walking down the aisle. Susanna would blush and laugh it off, but deep down, she couldn't help but think about it too. Sylvester's parents were also happy with Susanna. They liked her quiet demeanor and her dedication to her work. They could see that she was a good influence on their son, and that made them happy. This, of course, did not sit well with Amaka. She had been trying to win Sylvester's affection for years, and now it seemed all her efforts had been in vain. Feeling defeated, Amaka decided to leave town. Before she left, Sylvester's mom gave her a large sum of money as some sort of compensation, hoping it would help her start anew. Amaka took the money and left, feeling bitter but also ready to move on with her life. Despite their growing bond, Sylvester and Susanna found it challenging to balance their relationship and their professional lives. Being a couple while also having a boss-employee relationship was not easy. There were times when things got stressful and they found it hard to keep their personal feelings separate from their work. After a few months, Susanna decided that it was time for a change. She wanted to focus on her career and use her skills as a food scientist. She applied for a new job and was soon offered a position that would allow her to do just that. It was a difficult decision, but she knew it was the right one. When Susanna handed in her resignation letter, Sylvester was disheartened. He didn't want her to leave, but he understood why she had to go. He tried to put on a brave face, but it was clear that he was going to miss her. As he read the letter, his eyes fell on the last lines. My boss, my soulmate, a love so clear. Sylvester smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart. He knew that no matter where Susanna went, their bond would remain strong. They had found something special in each other, and that was something that could never be taken away. And so, as Susanna started her new job and Sylvester continued to run his company, they both looked forward to the future. They knew that there would be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together hand in hand, knowing that their love was strong enough to overcome anything. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures, where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.